Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased today to announce today's speaker. We're really honored that Dr. Karina Walters was able to come and join us today. Dr. Walters is going to be providing a lecture on bodies don't just tell stories, they tell history, embodiment of historical trauma and microaggression distress. Dr. Walters is the William P. and Ruth Gerberding Endowed Professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work. She is an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She's founded and direct a university-wide interdisciplinary Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington, and she's also a faculty affiliate of the university's West Coast Poverty Center, which is an interdisciplinary hub for research, policy, and education. A recent recipient of the Fulbright Award, her research focuses on historical, social, and cultural determinants of physical and mental health among American Indian and Alaskan Natives. She served as a principal investigator on several groundbreaking studies with funding from the National Institute of Health and other funding sources. Her work looks at health risk outcomes among American Indian individuals, families, and community. We're looking forward to her presentation today. I've had an opportunity to work and interact with Karina on a number of occasions over the past few years. She is truly one of the native scholars of our profession that's moving forward a really extensive and very prolific agenda. So, Karina, welcome to the Graduate School of Social Work.
Thanks. Thank you, Dean Williams. Halito sa Chief Karina Walters, Micha Chata Sioke. Good morning, good afternoon. It's really an honor to be here, and thank you, Dean Williams, and thank you to GSSW for having me here today. I want to first pay my respects to the indigenous peoples of this land, the Arapaho, as well as the Cheyenne and Ute and other tribes in this area. I'm really grateful to be here. I'd like to acknowledge any elders that might be present or original inhabitants who are still here with us today in this room, so thank you for being here. And also want to pay my respect to the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center because I'll be sharing some data that they also helped with. So thank you guys for being here too. Now that I've cut into 10 minutes of my talk, I'm going to have to hurry on through. I'm going to talk a little bit about historical trauma today. And one of the things that I want to talk about with respect to it is a part of historical trauma that most folks don't talk about, which is the relationship to land and place. And I want to also, in the same way as I acknowledge the indigenous land that we're on now and the ancestral ties, I want to also acknowledge my own people. This is our traditional mound, a sacred place where we came from, called Nanawaya, outside of, not far from Jackson, Mississippi. And this is the place that we were removed from during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. So I'm going to kind of reflect a little bit on that and some of the process related to that as I talk about historical trauma. But I do want to talk about historical trauma beyond the psychological and beyond the physical, but also the relationship to space and place. So I'll highlight that a bit today. But first I want to start with a story. And this is actually from the Cherokee side of my family. This is a story about hummingbird. Long, long time ago, back when the animals and human beings understood each other's language, back when we understood each other and spoke with one another in a good way, there was an old lady and she was dying. She was really, really sick, and the animals all loved her. And they gathered a great council together to meet and figure out what they can do to help her so she could live. And at that time, human beings had already kind of had a problem in terms of respecting the tobacco medicine properly. And the tobacco left, and there was only one plant left. Tobacco had moved south, and it was guarded by these two giant greedy geese. Now, you gotta know, this is the old days. We're not talking about geese like you see in the park now. We're talking about dinosaur geese, you know, giant geese. Even bear and panther said, I don't want to have anything to do with those geese. They are mean. So these geese were really greedy. They refused to share that plant with anybody. And so all the animals gathered and said, well, we need that tobacco to help this lady get her strength back, get her health back. And so they had this council, and they said, well, who's going to go do it? And bear and panther said, nah, I'm not messing with those geese. I'm not going to go. Little mole said, hey, I'll do it. I know how I'll do it. I'll burrow down into a tunnel, and I'll come up through the ground, and I'll take it by its roots, and I'll pull it right out from underneath those geese's beaks. They said, okay, go ahead, mole. Give it a shot. So mole went down, and he burrowed down, and his little head popped up, and he got eaten. So that didn't work. That just reinforced it for bear and panther. Said, I'm definitely not going down there now. And they said, well, we need to do something. And Hummingbird said, hey, I can do something. And they're like, wow, Hummingbird's really fast. And so Hummingbird said, I know what I'll do. I'm going to distract him, and I'll get it, and I'll be able to come back. So that's what Hummingbird did. Hummingbird went over there, and he went, geese, geese. He went, geese, geese. He came back, and he took that tobacco plant back to the people. And he built a fire, and in that fire, he dropped that tobacco. And with his beak, he drew up that tobacco smoke into his beak. And he blew that tobacco smoke into that grandmother's mouth so that she could live. And that's how tobacco came back to the people. So, I tell that story for a reason, a number of reasons. One is I'm going to talk a lot about the embodiment of historical trauma and the embodiment in terms of risk behaviors as well. And as we know, if we relate to indigenous people around the world have different protocols and understandings and ways of relating in the world. And one of the hallmarks of respecting medicines is if you don't respect medicines, they can disrespect you. And this story is a little bit about that. So I guess the modern question is, at what point did we shift our relationship to tobacco to the point now where it's killing us? And where did that get interrupted, and what happened? And I want to acknowledge, though, that there is ceremonial use of tobacco in our communities that's done in a good way, and it's still healthful for our people. So I'm not talking about that kind of tobacco use. I'm talking about that commercial tobacco use that's being done now, to the point where it's one of the #1 killers for our people. So what happened in terms of that shifting relationship? What happened that we began to embody these risk behaviors, especially since tobacco is an original medicine? Tobacco was used for, and is still used for, things like fevers, stomach aches, asthma, rheumatism, earaches, toothaches, childbirth pain, open wounds, bug repellent, keeping evil spirits away, communicating with Creator, among many, many other uses. So this was traditionally a medicine for a number of our peoples. So I'm going to kind of recycle back to that and talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But the big question that I have for us today is, how do traumatic stressors and events become embodied in our physical and mental health, as well as in our risk behaviors? How do we literally carry these traumas and these stories with us where we go? And for those of us who don't carry those stories, how did that happen? How were we able to resist embodying those stories? I'm going to be drawing a little bit from the Indigenous stress coping model that we work from, and that's going to be talking about the historical trauma events. And then also I'm going to talk today about microaggression events. And then ultimately, the most important thing is looking at cultural protective factors that buffer the impact of those kinds of events on our wellness. And again, reemphasizing, I'm talking about wellness from a much more holistic perspective: mind, body, spirit, land, and how that all comes together. You know what, I've had lots of cups of coffee this morning, so if I'm talking too fast, just wave me down. I'll be happy to slow down. If you have a question, please feel free to interrupt, and I'll be happy to clarify. When we talk about, I'm drawing from the work of Nancy Krieger in terms of embodiment, and her work really emphasizes how social and historical inequities can literally become embodied. And just as bodies tell histories and stories, anthropologists can look at bones and tell the whole history of what people ate, what their diets were. They can tell a whole story about people's experiences. Our bodies, too, carry lived experiences that our ancestors had as well. So our contemporary bodies do express these stories of our lived experiences, whether or not we are conscious of these stories. So what is relevant to social work and research? Well, studying the embodiment of microaggression distress and historical trauma, as well as the corresponding health consequences, basically allows us to determine the forces that are currently driving intergenerational patterns of health and disease in our communities. Okay, but there's a debate that rages, even among my Native colleagues. And the debate is a good empirical question. Basically, historical trauma, that happened a long time ago. So maybe it's really contemporary lifetime lived trauma that is really the major factor that we should be paying attention to, and that historical trauma is more noise to the equation. And that's a reasonable question to ask. I'm looking to some of the epigenetic research that's coming out now and some of the amassing of evidence at the cellular level that there's a powerful, stressful environmental conditions that can leave an imprint or a mark on the cellular material around your DNA that can possibly be carried into future generations. There's some new work that literally on the cellular level that stress in one generation can be literally transmitted into the future generation. And there's a neurobiological toll. There's some really interesting research, for example, maternal child health. Women who are pregnant and have extreme nutritional stress during pregnancy can lead to changes that actually predispose their children as adults to have diabetes, CVD, hypertension, and so forth. There's some interesting famine studies that are coming out of Sweden as well that actually look at famine in one generation and then how you feed your children in the next generation if you overfeed them at certain developmental times. And what do we know about the trauma of not having food? What do people tend to do in the next generation? Overfeed as a way as part of the trauma of that. At certain developmental points in time, that can then put those adult offspring at incredibly high risk for CVD, diabetes, and hypertension. All factors that Native people already disproportionately have high rates in. So there's something going on here. It's just a matter of kind of disentangling some of this. So embodiment basically reminds us that we cannot exclude social, historical, or cumulative experiences that impact our wellness, and that historical trauma may in part produce health disparities in a wide spectrum of outcomes from diabetes to PTSD. And so that's some of the work that we're starting to try to work our way through a bit here. I want to acknowledge the data I'm going to be sharing with today. It's funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. We had a number of partners in various cities. The National Native American AIDS Prevention Center was one of them. This study took place at 6 sites: Seattle, Tacoma, San Francisco, Oakland, LA, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Tulsa, Oklahoma City. I want to honestly say all of Oklahoma just about because everyone drove to participate. And this was a study focused on gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and I'm going to use the word two-spirit, health in our communities with a special emphasis on HIV prevention issues as well. The reason why we focused on cities is we were looking at really high rates of the cities with some of the highest rates, prevalence rates of HIV for Native populations, and also because we felt that at that time it would be responsive to some of the pressing needs our communities had. Good example, the reason why we also focused on cities, when I talked to a Choctaw relative of mine, and I asked Panchi, I said, Panchi, what's it like being gay in Broken Bow, which is a very kind of traditional community in the southeastern part of Oklahoma? He says, I don't know, I'm only gay when I'm in Tulsa. So, there you go. And I said, well, what are you when you're in Broken Bow? And he says, I'm Yukpa, which in our language means happy. He said, I'm the best beater. I do a women's stitch. All the ladies come to me for the best quilting. And I'm the caretaker of the kids in the community. So when grandma needs to go to the store, I'm the place where they drop off. So understanding the different ways our communities describe ourselves is really important, and it's varied. So, okay. Just to give you an idea, trying to find American Indians, Alaska Natives in urban samples and getting a representative sample is hard enough. But trying to get two-spirit American Indians is a little bit like getting a red rainbow in a needle in a haystack. It's pretty tough. But what we had to do is something fairly clever and fun, and we did respondent-driven sampling. And what that is we basically start with 6 people who are very diverse in terms of economically diverse and gender diverse in our samples, who are two-spirit people. And we asked them to basically give us a list of all their friends who are two-spirit that they'd feel comfortable talking to. And that meant, no, it couldn't be Joe, the Starbucks guy, who they think may probably be, but not sure. It had to be somebody that they knew pretty well. And from there, we randomly sampled within their networks, and that's how we carried through the rest of them. So just to give you an idea, this is the Seattle site. So we started with 6 folks. And then, of course, when you do Native research, quite often you get volunteers who want to participate, even though we haven't, asked them to. They haven't been selected in. So we actually had to code them differently to track them to see if they're any different than our respondent-driven sampling folks. So we did include them in our sample. And I can tell you right now, there were no, after all of the money that we spent on doing this fancy sampling, there were no differences on any key demographics. But okay, so we had the volunteers, and when I originally got into HIV research a number of years ago, I was actually asked, or actually was told by an elder to get into HIV research, actually Rosemary Richmond at the American Indian Community House. I had just arrived in New York City, and she said, what can you do for us in terms of research? And I said, well, at the time I could do mental health research. She said, no, I need an HIV researcher. And I said, I don't know anything about HIV. And she said, well, I'm not really asking. So that's how I got into HIV research, and it was actually out of that experience because she said, I've been to about 14 funerals this year. Right now in New York City and New York State are saying only one person who's Native has died from this disease, and I know 14 people who have died from this disease. So there's a disconnect between what's out there and what's really going on in our communities. At the same time, we had a Native elder who expressed interest in participating as a volunteer in the study, and she was in her 70s. And so I couldn't say no to her, although I had to say to the grandmother, I said, Grandma, after 3 hours of talking with her and finding out about our family history and everything, and when she said, okay, I'll participate, and I had to say, well, we're going to have to ask about your sex life. And she said, well, that's fine. And of course, all of our interviewers at that site, all of our younger interviewers said, oh no, I'm not interviewing her. So we are very respectful of people who do say they really want to participate. We want to build on that enthusiasm in our communities, but we do track them differently. Okay, so here it is in Seattle. The black dots are all the folks who actually did agree to participate. And what's kind of cool is you can see we have isolated networks here and networks that are outside of these really dense networks, which means we did a pretty good job of getting into other waves far enough along. From a health prevention perspective, this is interesting because the bad news is if a disease gets in our community, what do we see? How quickly? Because this person over here is related to this person all the way down here. The good news is if we're doing HIV prevention interventions, and NAPSI does a lot of this incredible work, is when we do a community intervention with key leaders who are well connected, we can have a diffusion of that intervention fairly quickly. So that's the good news from that. Okay, so we had about 447 people, fairly impoverished. Despite having a high school education, 3/4 of our population had household income under $18,000, and these are big cities. So major issues there with respect to that. Okay, so let's turn to historical trauma. So we are all on the same page. When I'm talking about historical trauma, I'm talking about something that can be conceptualized as an event or set of events perpetrated on a group of people, including their environment, not just the people themselves, who share a specific group identity, and in this case, tribal identity, with genocidal and or ethnocidal intent. Okay, this isn't a natural disaster. This is a group is targeted with the attempt to systematically either eradicate the group as a people or eradicate their culture and life ways. Okay? And the intention is to literally disrupt those life ways, culture, and identity. Ethnocide is just another form of genocide. Individually, each event is profoundly traumatic, but taken together, they can constitute a history of sustained cultural disruption and destruction directed at particular communities. In our communities, we talk about how the trauma is held and transmitted over generations. Even family members who didn't experience the event can feel the effects of that event generations later. And the resulting trauma is often conceptualized as collective. It's not about an individual experience, but it's really about a collective experience, in that it impacts a significant portion of the community. And it can be compounding, because for most of these communities that are targeted this way, it's not a one-time deal, right? It's usually a number of events that have happened that continue to create a lot of stress in a particular community. In research, it's confusing because it's talked about in all kinds of different ways. You hear this term historical trauma, and people might be referencing it in 4 or 5 different ways, so I just wanted to highlight that. Some people talk about it as ideological agents, and I'm going to focus on that today. Historically traumatic events as the precipitating event that causes certain kinds of poor outcomes for populations. Okay? Other people talk about historical trauma as a response to these historically traumatic events, that there are unique trauma responses that communities go through that's tied to the historical trauma event. Other folks will talk about it as a mechanism or a pathway. How do we understand how trauma literally gets transmitted across generations? And then in the research, there's a lot of historical trauma-related stressors that interact with proximal stressors. Good example of that is a high levels of unresolved grief and collective mourning that our communities have due to a lot of like motor vehicle accidents, high rates of death in our communities. So how do we understand the impact of historical trauma when we're looking at those kinds of impact as well? And how do these things interact with one another? So basically the simultaneous use of this historical trauma term to encapsulate all these different processes makes it difficult to theorize historical trauma and a little bit of a challenge to date. Okay. So some of the impact of historical trauma, scholars have done some of the research in this already. I wanted to just acknowledge like Dr. Tess Evans-Campbell, Les Wetbeck, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, among others in our field. But basically there's both individual and communal levels of impact. At the individual level, that includes disruptions in family communication, mental health symptoms such as PTSD, survivor guilt. One of the ways I want to talk about survivor guilt is a little bit different than what you might see in the literature. Good example is a colleague of mine. She was a descendant of 2 grandmothers that survived the Wounded Knee Massacre. And she used to say that if she felt like she was willing to let go of that pain, and really be happy, she felt like somehow she was betraying her ancestors. And so that's kind of a unique form of survivor guilt. Then looking at collective responses at the community level. But I really want to highlight that despite exposure to high levels of historical trauma, most of our communities are doing pretty well. And most individuals are doing incredibly well. So kind of what are the questions I have are what are the mechanisms or what are the processes that have buffered the effects of those kinds of events on our outcomes? And even some researchers are talking about areas of Native culture, such as being put on reservations, actually have been able to be places over time as sites of resistance to the very ways in which they were originally intended. So, so there's some interesting work coming out of that. We've done a lot of work with focus groups across a number of studies to say, well, what do we mean by historical trauma and doing measurement development? And of course, the theme of genocide came up. I want to acknowledge one of the most infamous ones that came up from this area is the Sand Creek Massacre here in 1864. How many of you are familiar with that one? Yeah, so that was not too far from here. The other ones are reservation period allotments. And you know, when I think about the impact on our health, and this is the commodity foods being handed out for rations on the reservations. You know, when people were put on reservations, these were military encampments. These were military prisons. They were not places where people could freely come and go. And part of colonialism is to get the host country to become dependent on the main country as a way to enforce colonialism. And so in this way, the same with food. So you wonder why 3 generations later, we're dealing with really incredibly high rates of diabetes and obesity and other kinds of things in our communities when people got cut off from this as a food source. Spiritual and environmental traumas also are a huge part of this. These are the buffalo skulls. General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Lakota was to kill the buffalo. And a lot of people misunderstand this to mean really cutting off people's food supply. It's much deeper than that. So another piece to think about historical trauma that I want us to note is that historical trauma not only puts a disruption in culture and lifeways, but it actually, the intent is to interrupt people's ability to fulfill their original instructions as a tribal people. It's an actual attempt to cut that off. So it was much more meaningful to the tribal communities when the buffalo kills happened, especially to the Plains tribes, where the Buffalo Nation are their relatives, their ceremonies, their whole structure of life revolved in many ways around their relationship to the buffalo. So when you cut off that relationship, it's a spiritual cutoff. It's also original instructions disruption in a huge way. And then, of course, the boarding school period. I'm not going to belabor this point, but 1880s. A couple of significant things happened in the 1880s from the historical trauma point of view. First of all, in the 1880s, we became almost fully human. Up until then, in law, we were not fully necessarily human. So we almost became fully human in 1880s, 1879, right around then. What happens when you become almost human? A couple of things. One is you become educatable. So the boarding school became a way of trying to the nice word is assimilate, but it's ethnocidal in intent. It was the intention to kill the Indian to save the man, to take Native kids out of their home, purposefully away from anywhere near their families for an average 7 years, to be placed in these school environments to kill the Indian in them, literally. And quite often these environments were very abusive, in the early days in particular, and high rates of trauma. As a matter of fact, when our communities, when the Catholic churches came out about some of the issues related to this, it was not surprising because there's a lot of discourse in our communities about some of the people that were sent to the reservation communities at the time were people that people were trying to hide. So people ended up having incredibly high rates of exposure to sexual abuse and physical violence. In some communities, for example, in Canada, as high as 90% of the community had been abused by the local priest, so pretty intense. About 100,000 of our children were forced to attend these schools. If you didn't attend these schools, you'd have food rations withheld from your community or you could be imprisoned. So this was not a choice. So the boarding schools happened in the 1880s. The other thing that happened was the Court of Indian Offenses. At the same time this went on, if you were found practicing your religion or your spirituality or any of your cultural life ways, you can also be imprisoned and food rations withheld from your community. The third thing that happened was, and I'll show you this in a second, if you have enough intelligence to be educable, you have enough opportunity then to be called mentally ill. So I'll talk about that in a minute. This is Carlisle Indian School, one of the first classes that went through. As you can see, it's very militaristic. And what I really want to note is that attending one of these schools, you're not parented. You're parented by a system, you're not parented by families. You lose contact with stories about how to conduct yourself in the world, how to understand gender and sexuality and relationships, all of the things that are really important to our health and wellness as a people. And look at how young some of these kids are, right? This is Tom Torino when he first arrived at Carlisle Indian School. This is him 3 years later. And I don't know why the picture's doing that, but kids had their heads shaved when they arrived. And then one of the things that was really powerful, a lot of the children, when they were removed from their homes, when they had their head shaved, some of the narratives that came back was they thought that their parents were killed. And that's because it's a sign of mourning in some of our communities. To cut your hair means that someone has died. So children were very confused, very homesick. In terms of HIV prevention in our communities, colonization and sexuality, how did this interrupt and deteriorate our understanding? And also, just to highlight, the boarding schools also had the explicit intent of having natives adopt Christianity. That was actually an explicit process there. So here's a picture of one young woman when she first arrived and then later on. And then mental health. So in the 1880s, they established the very first insane asylum for American Indians, the Hiawatha Insane Asylum in Canton, South Dakota. And it was not staffed by nurses or doctors for at least a year, horrible conditions. And guess who would you guess were put there during this period? If you were to guess in the this late 1880s when this was first being developed. Who would be selected to go to, who would be considered mentally ill? Women, yeah, so some of the, well, certainly women who are involved in medicine. Yeah, the medicine people. There's a lot of medicine people, and they've got a list of a number of the folks who were originally put there. Young men, anybody who stood up to the system. So you got boarding schools, you got Court of Indian Offenses, and you got this was not long ago, right? This is not long ago. This is, you know, my grandfather was born into this generation. This is not long ago. Okay. So what is some of the impact of historical trauma? The colonial impact. I talked a little bit about the disruption in our ability to fulfill our original instructions, a disruption in our relational ways of being, in terms of understanding our relationship to our ancestors, to future generations as well. I think that's really a major issue. Disruption in our spatial obligations and relationships. Breakdown in our boundaries, both physical, mental, spiritual, in relation to land, and then creating systems of dependency on the colonial nation state. Some of the decolonizing practices to get beyond this, and I'll highlight this a little bit later, is how do we restore or reconnect with our original instructions? That's how we can grow our interventions. How do we create relational restoration, repair relational ways of being, boundaries, relationships to one another, and our land, and our ways of life. And transformation, in terms of narrative transformation. You know, it was not traditional to our people to be violent in some of the ways that our communities have become violent. And so where did we learn this? What are our original instructions? So to give you an example of this, when I was working with a group of elders in the Northwest, they asked me to come in to talk about diabetes. And this is a group of grandmas who gathered around and said, you know, we want to develop an intervention. And at the time, right before I came in, I was told that incredibly high rates of type 2 diabetes among some of the Native kids, and really high rates of obesity among these children. And I had done archival research in this particular community, and I saw old photographs, and this community was lean and mean. And so it was interesting to see, well, what's happening now? Why are these kids suffering with such high rates of diabetes and obesity? So I went in, and I'm an outsider to this tribal community. I might be Choctaw, but I'm not from this community, so I'm an outsider. And I had to go in very respectfully, and I knew it was going to be an interesting meeting. It was only grandmas all sitting at a table to meet with me, to talk to me about this issue. And the first thing they said to me was, don't be sending any skinny white ladies in here to tell us about, you know, our bodies, or what kind of foods to eat, or what our body types are, because we've always been big, our children have always been big, and that's just how we are. And I was like, okay. So that told me a couple things. One, it told me that these women have been through a lot already, and they're going to do anything to protect their kids, and I need to honor that and respect that. It also told me that they had a certain discourse about being big that I needed to pay attention to and understand the roots of. It also told me and reminded me that I'm an outsider and I needed to show my respect properly in this community. And so whenever we do historical trauma interventions in our communities, you never start with the trauma. Navajo man once said, when he had a man who was diabetic and he had just lost one of his legs, and came to him, he said, you know, help me, you know, get cured from this diabetes and illness. And he went on and on about all the struggles he has. And the first thing that Navajo roadman said to him was, good. And he's like, good? I just told you all my problems. You say good? And he says, well, you got to start with the beauty before we do this. So same with historical trauma. We don't start with the trauma. Instead, we got to start with the beauty and the original instructions if we're going to heal from that perspective. So I switched gears with these grandmas, and I said, grandmothers, can you share with me anything that you're allowed to share with an outsider about your original instructions as a people, about how you lived with the land, what your food was, and stories like that. And they started talking amongst themselves, and they came up with these beautiful stories. And one of them said, oh yeah, you know, when the certain butterfly comes out, we know to pick these berries. And then the other one said, well, you know, we haven't taught our grandchildren that story yet, you know. And then that gave me the opportunity to find out the disruption. So I said, can you tell me when that got disrupted? When, as a people, the collective, did your ability to fill your original instructions get disrupted? What was the big turning point for your people? And they said, oh, when we got moved onto this reservation. And I said, okay, so what happened? What happened when you moved on this reservation? What was so disturbing? And they said, well, we starved. We had a huge period of starvation. They gave us the sacks of flour and corn. None of that was our traditional food. We had no idea what to do with that. Then we couldn't fish, we couldn't hunt, we couldn't do any of our traditional stuff. So we literally starved. It was a horrible period. And then I turned it to the children, right? Because the intervention's about the kids. And I said, can you tell me what your grandmas and grandpas did to protect those babies? How did they survive? And they said, oh, well, we overfed them. The kids who got the most food, we fed them first, and the kids who were plump survived. Aha. The light bulb went off. And then, so then I reframed it. This is the relational and the narrative transformation. I said, so what you're telling me isn't cultural, right? Being plump isn't cultural. It was a historical trauma response to a very difficult situation a couple generations before. It's a coping response that your ancestors did so that your children can live and so you can be here. So is that still working now? And they said no. And I said, but you know what? You're still dealing with malnutrition in this generation. Obesity is another form of malnutrition. I said, so now you have a chance to come up with a new intervention for the next 7 generations for your children. That's the spatial and relational restoration, starting to connect to what we do in the here and now is connected to our future generations. What we do in the here and now is connected to past generations. Eduardo Duran talks about this in terms of clients who come in who are feeling maybe really depressed and having a really hard time. And the first thing he'll say is, you are in such a powerful place to be. And it's like totally contrary to someone who's been, you know, in a mental health system for a really long time. Like, what do you mean? I feel completely powerless. Well, no. In this moment, if you begin to heal yourself, you're healing all the hurts of those ancestors you carry. What a beautiful place to be. In this moment, you're healing for the next 7 generations. What an incredible place to be. it shifts the thinking around how we approach it. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I was saving that for later on in the talk. But okay, so let's turn to microaggressions and talk a little bit about that. Microaggressions. Now, why microaggressions? They have to do with the chronic, everyday stressors that people endure, that people of color and other groups, LGBT groups, you can plug in your own group into some of this, so I want to acknowledge that. But microaggressions, I'm going to speak about mostly from a Native point of view today. These are those everyday nicks and tears that you experience as a Native person living in our world, that if you paid attention to every moment that you've had with somebody or your environment, you'd probably lose your mind by 5 o'clock. So we figure out a way to get through some of these wear and tears. And I love the way Mandalani Alulimeyer says it, and I think she captures a form of this. She says, "What a fascinating thing life is. I have survived the many, many stories of how I think, what I know, and who I am, all told by those who are well-meaning, well-dressed, and well-ignorant of the deeper sides of my cultural epistemology." So these microaggressions are these chronic, everyday injustices that Native people endure. They're interpersonal and environmental messages. It's not just a one-on-one situation. It's even in our environment. These messages that are denigrating, demeaning, invalidating. They involve verbal and nonverbal interactions. Nonverbals are really incredibly powerful, sometimes even more powerful than the words that are said or expressed. And they're very stressful. Now, why are they stressful? So a good example is you're in line, it might be a Native person in line at McDonald's, and you're waiting for your turn, and there just happens to be a white person behind you, and the teller jumps over you to pull that person behind you to come up to go ahead and take the order. And in that moment, that person has to decide, did that just happen? Are they passing me over because? How do I now deal with this? So what it does is it puts the burden on the recipient of that event to figure out how to deal with it. That's stressful. You have to decide in that moment, am I going to deal with it or not? Now, the other piece is, you quite often, microaggressions that happen with even our loved ones and people we really care about, our best friends. We've all committed, microaggressions. If you have any power and privilege and any kind of status, at some point in your life, you've definitely done it. So, part of the issue is when you receive it, you then have to think about the intentionality of the person who's also perpetrating it. So if it's someone you really care about, it's like, did they mean to do that? Did they just not know any better? So it's a lot to negotiate in that moment. And in that moment, when you're sitting there going, okay, do I deal with this? Or if it's like not entirely a clear microaggression, you think maybe it is, and you have to deal with it, there's a couple of reactions that people typically give, right? So if I decide now I'm going to confront this person who's doing this microaggression, what kind of reaction might I get? Volunteers. Denial. Yeah, denial's a common one. Oh, no, that didn't really happen. The real mystification is when people say it didn't even happen, right? What else? Anger, right? So then you get anger, and in some cases, your safety might be an issue, depending where you are in the country and where you're at. What else? Anger, denial, humiliation. That could be another one. My favorite is a social work one. This is a common one in social work. Oh, come on, you guys, you got to know this. This is where the event happens, and then you confront the person, and they're like, oh, no, I'm so sorry for all that. And then before you know it, they're like on your shoulder and crying, and you're still pissed, and you're having to emotionally caretake the person who just perpetrated a microaggression on you. That's stressful and tiring, too. Okay. So Daryl Bingsu talks about 3 types of micro-insults, micro-invalidations, and micro-assaults. Those insults are those kind of, insensitivity, rudeness. Eye-rolling is a good example of a typical one. So you say, oh, my daughter might raise her hand in class and say, oh, that's like our people, American Indian, and the class goes, oh, the eye roll. Now you have a word for it. Okay, that's a micro-insult. I saw it. Micro-invalidations, that's where they nullify your experience and your reality. A good example for a lot of Native people, regardless of how dark or light you are you a real Indian? And what's interesting in terms of the psychological colonization part of it, in terms of microaggressions, is the authority by which people who perpetrate feel that they have the right to determine for others everything. It's really a fascinating process in and of itself. And you might get it from people who've absolutely had no contact with Natives. Their only reference points is Dances with Wolves. And now they're the experts, and they're going to decide how Indian or not you are. That's common. That's a very common experience. And then the micro-assaults are more what we kind of think about in terms of basic blatant discrimination, right? Where someone, and the perpetrator knows better in micro-assaults. They know they're crossing a line. There might be more subtle ones like, yeah, I shouldn't tell this joke, but, you know, think twice then about it. So those are a little bit more example. Give you an example of one that happened to me years ago. That person's no longer there, so don't try to guess. But when I was at the University of Washington, a faculty member had asked me if I would be willing to come to class to speak on American Indian issues. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And I was brand new faculty, so I was, wanting to be really accommodating to my colleagues. And then she said, great, would you come dressed as an Indian? And I was like, I had one of those moments like, no, she did not just say that. And then I'm like, no, she really did. And then I'm like, having to play. And then, of course, I had to go through my head, does she have tenure? Do I have tenure? So you got to do with power, right? And then I had to say, well, she wasn't from this country, so I thought maybe the intentionality I had to go to, maybe she just doesn't know better, and maybe she watches one too many Dances with Wolves or something. I don't know. So I used humor. Humor is one of the best ways a lot of us deal with these kinds of events, right? And so I thought I'll teach her as an educator, and I'll say to her, and what I said was, just so you know that no matter how I'm dressed as an Indian. And she's like, can you wear like earrings? And I was like, oh no. First she said costume. Can you come? No, what I meant was a costume. I'm like, okay, we don't call it a costume, and no, I wouldn't do that. Then she went on to earrings. So by then, we're digging a deeper hole, and I'm furious at this point. And I said to her, I'll tell you what, I'll come dressed as an Indian to your class if I can talk about whatever I want to talk about. And she said, yeah, that'd be great. She's like, that's fantastic. And so what did I do? I wore my best suit, kind of like this. Absolutely nothing that could mark me as Native in her mindset. Walked in the class, the first thing I said is, class, I'm dressed as an Indian. We're going to do a whole lecture on microaggressions today. Yeah, she still didn't get it, so that's okay. Okay, so, these kind of things are stressful, and these are environmental messages. So even not being talked about in your history classes, you think about what our children are exposed to, we're only talked about as in relation to American conflict. Right? We're not talked about as the incredible contributions Indigenous people have to science or anything else in this world. And same with other populations, right? So here's a couple examples. I think pictures say 1,000 words. These are micro-invalidations. This is Kesha. I don't know what she was thinking. But we actually asked people how often did they experience these events and how distressing these events were. So a good example of some of the items from ours is being told by a non-Native person that he or she was an Indian in a past life, or their grandmother was a Cherokee princess. Here's some of the, Thanksgiving, from Columbus Day through Thanksgiving, it's stressful for anyone who has parents who are Native. You're going to at least go visit the school probably once. And objectification is not uncommon, right? You can see that with other populations. Gives new meanings with Dances with Wolves. And the YMCA, other kinds of things, representation of things that are supposedly indigenous when they're not. Iron Eyes Cody is not American Indian. He's Italian. This was Miss Universe in 2004. And the thing that's really distressing is, these are not real eagle feathers, thank goodness, and nor would we ever wear a bonnet this way. But bonnets are saved for incredibly high status in our communities and for the communities that have bonnets. And it's just really disrespectful all the way around. But the interesting thing is, this is one of the things I want you to really think about is, microaggressions don't exist independent of having a purpose. Microaggressions, Patricia Hill Collins talks about this as controlling images. They actually serve an important purpose, and one of the main purposes it serves is to maintain status quo. Another thing that it does is it cartoonizes us. It renders us invisible or unidimensional, and actually not real. If we're not real and we're not authentic human beings, we don't have to be negotiated with or dealt with. We don't have to be honored. We don't have to have humanity. Okay, so that's some of the issues around that. But what they do is they turn the story on its head. They turn the story upside down. So whenever you see a microaggression, if you're wondering if it's a microaggression, just know the opposite is true. So a good example of this is the image of Native women as squaws and the mistreatment of Native men to Native women. You know, most of our societies were matrilineal, matriarchal, and those that weren't still had a very valued and highly respected position for Native women in our cultures. So this story is literally on its head. Another example is the term Indian giver. What does that mean? What's an Indian giver? Someone who gives something and takes it back. Has that happened? Yeah, yeah, not by us, right? So the story is on its head. So somehow we take back anything that we're given. Indigenous people are known for our generosity. And the misappropriation of culture and religion and spirituality, all of that's part of this as well. And then, of course, the micro-insults that are, you know, much more explicit. A good example is the assumption of not doing your fair share of your work because you're Native. But again, turning the story on its head, remember I started with a tobacco story. A lot of advertisements about how our tobacco is bad. That's an actual postcard. And then better yet, reselling and repackaging tobacco back to our Native youth as if it's an indigenous thing in this way. And here's another one, alcohol. Alcohol is cultural. That is what the message is that they want to send, when in fact, alcohol, certainly, like we give our little children alcohol jiggers. This was from Wall Drugs. Has anyone been to Wall Drug? Oh man, I went there after ceremonies, right? I had just left Sundance Grounds and I had to do a pit stop and it was the only place to go and it was during Custer Days. That was a strange experience when you're coming out of ceremony. It just, but anyway, so this was there. And the thing is, the idea is that alcohol is somehow cultural to us, when in fact alcohol was introduced by Benjamin Franklin, and he said the best way to extirpate these savages is by the means of rum. And he said that to Congress. And it was actually a plan to use alcohol as a way to negotiate with us for our land and to kill us. Okay, our youth are affected by this too, right? So people don't think twice about these kinds of representations. And then of course microassaults. The assumption of criminality, being followed in a store, being trailed in a store, things like that are a good example of microassaults. This was a bumper sticker in the 1970s for some of the fishing rights struggles in the Great Lakes area. Manifest Destiny, good example of another one. This was, you know, a Montana bar, no Indians allowed. Those kinds of stuff. Environmental messages I want to go back to again. A lot of our traditional places that are really holy to a lot of our communities are renamed as Squaw Peak, Devil's Tower, things like that. Again, turning the story on its head. This was a card that was used at a college, university. And then back to the Two-Spirit folks. Two-Spirit folks also have to deal with these kind of microaggressions in the Two-Spirit community and the complete invisibility of Indigenous people quite often. Or the other flip side is the over-romanticization and eroticization of us as Indigenous people. And the other two items that we came up, scales that we came up with that are different than Darrell Wing Su's work is colonial erasure, which is characterized by Indigenous experiences that erase our indigeneity. So, for example, always having to start with Indian 101 just to be heard. You can never start with an assumption that everyone understands our history. Another example is people saying how surprisingly articulate you are, things like that. Colonial authority is where non-natives assert colonial authority to control images, to invade physical space, or assert their own authority of all things native. That's where you get people being better Indians than Indians. Avatar, the movie, he's a better Indian than the Indians there, right? He gets the bird. How many saw that movie? Yeah, that's a good example. And then, of course, I wanted to share examples from other populations and groups. We can think of a whole bunch. Okay, so basically, as Cicera puts it, the, colonization is thingification, and Andy Smith says the extent to which Native peoples are not seen as real in the larger colonial discourse indicates a success of violence in destroying our perceived humanity, and ultimately, this kind of racism makes us sick. So, microaggressions in our actual data from some of the Two-Spirit women, I'm going to highlight a couple of those, and then I'm going to wrap up with in the next 5 minutes. Maxine, these are pseudonyms. Maxine says, people will come up to me and say, oh, I thought all Indians were dead. And you look at them and you think, well, how am I supposed to respond to this? You know, Emily Post doesn't have an appropriate response for, I thought you were all dead. It's like, no, we're not all dead. Roberta talks about it in terms of being in a nightclub. She says, the nightclub was loaded with white women. I mean, it was so thick, I just freaked, panicked. It's like I felt I was drowning because every time I said, excuse me, no one would move. People saw me, but they wouldn't move out of the way. It's like I'm in their space type of thing. It's like I'm always in their way, but in my reality, they're always in my way, you know? 20 years later, it's the same thing, and you know, I think the largest organizations out there want to and just don't know how to be respectful. I'm just way over that now, and I don't want to be the one now to try to teach them, because if they haven't gotten it by now, a part of me is like, well, what's the use? I've got other things to do. I've got a garden to plant. In terms of the intersectionality around some of these issues, and this also has to do with lateral oppression, so the other impact of microaggression distress is our own communities internalizing some of these, and it comes out and plays out through authenticity tests and other kinds of ways. But Maxine says, you know, the thing is, still to this day, when people insult me, you know, like someone calls me a bitch, when someone is rude to me, you know, I go through this thing in my head. Is it because I'm Indian? Is it because I'm poor? Is it because I'm a dyke? What is it that I did this time, you know, to have these people be hostile to me? I don't know sometimes why I'm being attacked. I just know that I'm wrong to a lot of people. I think there's a lot of hostility to the combination of things I am. And then this is the lateral oppression piece with Roberta saying, I remember sitting there in a sweat lodge and the medicine, that's the water, was being passed around. And one of the women saying, all of a sudden she came out and said, I would never drink from the same cup as a woman who is a lesbian. And it was just like, well, I hate to tell you this, but I just drank from it, you know. And you know, she laughs about this, but this was a major issue in terms of lateral oppression for our Two-Spirit folks, in terms of being denied access or feeling unsafe in ceremonial situations. So putting it all together, just to highlight some of the key findings here. So we asked people about their historical trauma experiences and these kinds of events. And we asked, did they experience it? Did their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents? And then what we did was, to address that debate I talked about earlier, we controlled for military combat exposure. We controlled for lifetime sexual and physical violence that people had been exposed to. We even controlled for their own historical trauma in their generation that they exposed to. So after pulling that out, we wanted to see, do these historical trauma events in past generations still have an impact on contemporary physical and mental health in this generation? And what we found is it does. And we're in the process of writing this paper up right now. But basically, what we're seeing, and I just giving you kind of the highlights here, is that disruptions related to community, family, things like that, disruptions related to historical trauma events related to disruptive experiences produced more relationships to depressive symptoms, but direct attacks on community, family, or person was related to PTSD in the present generation. And this is actually diagnosable PTSD. It's not PTSD symptoms. The other piece is we said, well, how about chronicity? How about number of events across generations? Does that have an effect on contemporary health? And we found that that held true as well. The more chronic historical trauma was reported across generations, it basically created a profile for present mental health in this generation, in this case, alcohol use. And going back to the issue of land, like I showed you earlier, the loss of land, forced relocation, not knowing where your ancestors are buried, all that was also related to poor physical and mental health in this generation. Going back to looking at smoking, back to the original question about kind of how does this embody, both in terms of pain and smoking. Pain in terms of is historical trauma or these traumatic events literally embodied and expressed through self-reported pain, right? Our community talks a lot about pain, and pain is one of those really difficult things to figure out clinically. So you can see here high levels of historical trauma loss in our community, reported higher rates among women and transgender folks, as well as microaggression distress, and high rates of non-traditional ceremonial tobacco use, 88% of the women, current smokers. In the Two-Spirit sample, you guys at NAPTI, did you see that? Wow, 88%. Okay, so basically what we found with each unit increase in historical trauma loss, that meaning how often you thought about historical trauma, was associated with 3.5 times the odds of current smoking. And we saw something similar with microaggressions with 2.2 times the odds. In terms of physical pain, we saw about 22% of the variance in physical pain could be attributed to historical loss after controlling for these other factors, and same with microaggression distress. So obviously something's going on, going back to the stress coping model, but not everybody experiences it the same way, so what really kind of buffers the impact of those experiences? Identity. So what we found is that people who had positive identity attitudes, they felt good about who they were as Indian, those kinds of microaggression distress experiences really didn't have an impact on self-reported health or pain. However, for those who didn't have a positive Indian identity, it did. So that certainly has implications for our future in terms of our measurement development. Future directions, just want to highlight in terms of research. I think chronic and acute historical trauma exposures may matter, but the intensity and duration of the events matter as well, so there's a lot of work to do to disentangle some of that. And then also, the other piece is to work with our tribal communities to look at resiliency and really kind of understand the role of resiliency through all of this. And then I just want to highlight, I talked a little bit already about some of the decolonizing practice strategies, separating out colonial trauma response from historical, what people call cultural, and creating new narratives. And I want to highlight with one last one, which is, to give you an example with narrative restoration. If a person, Eduardo Duran talks about this, and I really like this example. A person comes in who's really been in the mental health system a long time, really depressed, really having a hard time, and you ask them to introduce themselves, what would they usually say? They've been in the system for a long time. If I say, tell me about yourself, what's one of the first things they'll say? Their diagnosis, right? I'm depressed. And so to shake that up a little bit, Ed would say something like, well, is that what your mother named you? And the person's like, no. And he says, oh, he goes, but obviously you've been part of an important naming ceremony. And they're like, okay, this guy's a little wacky. What do you mean a naming ceremony? He goes, well, obviously you're named depressed. And clearly you've been part of an important ceremony, and the client by now is getting a little unnerved, which is okay, a little throwing something out of kilter here a little bit. And why does naming matter from a Native point of view? So this gets our original instructions in there as well. Naming, for most of our communities, provides protocols by which we conduct ourselves every day. It also tells the community how to respond to us. It tells us how we're to respond to the community. It gives us a way of living. Okay, so naming matters. So he said, who performed this naming ceremony? And the client goes, I don't know what you're talking about. He goes, well, it's a problem if you've been in a ceremony and you don't know it. So, the guys with the white jackets, and they have this very sacred text, and they all come together, and they open it up, and they have this big council, and they have this big meeting, that case manager meeting. They all come together, and they say, oh, let's think about this. Yeah, okay, yes, his name will be depressed. So you're depressed. And he's like, well, no, I don't know. He goes, well, what does that mean to you? What name would you give it if you're going to rename yourself? I don't know, sadness, I guess? Okay, let's talk about the spirit of sadness, the relational part. Let's talk about the spirit of sadness instead of sadness that just lives in you. If you have a spirit of sadness, it's something that you can relate to. It's something that you have a relationship to. If you have the spirit of sadness, you can set boundaries, right? You can determine when it visits you. If you have a what happens if you have a relationship? You can decide if a person visits or not, right? You can tell them when to go. So part of it is kind of restoring a relational way of approaching it so that you could say, okay, you can visit today for a little bit, but then you need to go. And Ed might even say something like, you've had a long relationship with the spirit of sadness, so you can't expect it to go away right away. So how are we going to do that? So that's just an example of the narrative restoration, relational restoration, and then incorporating some of the original instructions around boundaries and cultural protocols that could be embedded in. And then I want to end with my own community. We're working, a lot of our communities do commemorative memorializations on a collective level as a way to address restoring balance from historical trauma. The Wounded Knee, the Bigfoot Memorial Ride is a good example among the Lakota. For my tribe, we do a small portion of the Trail of Tears every year. But we're dealing with a generation where 1 out of 3 of our kids are going to get type 2 diabetes by 2050. 70% of my tribe now is obese or seriously overweight. We're dying. And so now we're trying to say, we've done a good job of telling people what not to do, but we've done a good job of telling people what to behaviorally do, but what we haven't done is communicated our original instructions around the values and cultural protocols by which we should live. And so we're going to rewalk the Trail of Tears this year and map it as a way to, through that walk, begin to ask our ancestors, instead of thinking about suicide prevention today, we're going to say, what is our value for life? Instead of substance abuse prevention, we're going to say, what is our value for our medicines? Instead of psychopathology prevention, we're going to say, how do we maintain balance in our lives? And when we get out of balance, how do we heal ourselves and get ourselves well? And that way we're going to hopefully develop our own health promotion model from our own Choctaw Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So, Yakoke, thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, first off, thank you for this. This was awesome. Very illuminating, and I loved what you shared about some of the interventions, kind of features that disruption.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. When I attended the International Society for Traumatic Stress Study, the intergenerational transmission of trauma was the phrase that was used at that time. But I saw in one of your slides that said historical trauma does not equal intergenerational.
Yes.
I wonder if you could address that.
Great question. I'm glad you brought me back to that. You can have intergenerational trauma. You can have a major volcanic explosion that displaces a whole group of people, that causes stress for that generations to come. And that causes huge catastrophic upheaval. But that volcanic explosion was not with the intent of genocide or ethnocide. And I think that's an important, I think a lot of people confuse, I think the biggest one where people get confused around are events like Hurricane Katrina. That's a really good example. Hurricane Katrina in of itself did not start off as a historical trauma event. Hurricane Katrina was a hurricane that came and caused devastation to a community. And some people would say, you know, in terms of how the levees were built and what communities were protected, predisposed, was clearly oppressive and a problem. But, you know, so you can start getting into the gray area. Does that start to become a historically trauma event? But it did become a historically traumatic event for that community based on the government's lack of response. And at that point, it really transitioned. And so the discourse around the inequities that were built into the levees and a whole bunch of other things came up out of that experience. So I would say that is now a historically traumatic event. But the hurricane in of itself wasn't. So that's an important distinction. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. Follow up? Okay.
Well, it just brought up a lot of stuff. One of the things we talked about in the grant that we're training on right now, but the ACEs study, the First Childhood Event Study. Any relationship with the research that you're doing?
I mean, a lot of our tribal communities are looking at the ACEs work, and I think I've been focused more on the adult end of things, and I think we have a lot of work that we need to do for our kids. And again, I think intentionality and the issues around that intentionality also have to really be looked at. So you can't just look at adverse childhood events independent of intergenerational events, as well as the meaning behind those events for our communities. So, yeah. D. Bigfoot does some really interesting work in there. D. Bigfoot for children and families.
Thank you.
Other questions? Points of clarification, so that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned identity as an important protective factor. Could you talk a little bit more about maybe that or other protective factors?
Sure. And I invite other Native folks in the audience to contribute to this especially as well. The way we were looking at identity, the way I actually started off as an identity mental health researcher, so that's where I started originally. I was interested in originally looking at how much we internalize or externalize colonizing attitudes about us as Native people, and the role of identity attitudes, not just behaviors. I think a lot of our identity research is focused heavily on behaviors to indicate or as a proxy for positive identity. So if you do a lot of cultural activities, for example, there's an embedded assumption that you're high on identity. And I started really rethinking that because I could think of examples in my own tribe with an elder or a leader in our community who speaks the language, very active in our community, very respected and revered elder, but also at the same time would express how he was so happy that the white people came to basically to teach us because we were savages. And I mean, he has a discourse about us as Choctaws that are really disturbing to me. So I thought, wow, behaviorally, if he just got that, you know, if he got a behavioral measure, he'd score high, but his attitudes about what that means as traditional Choctaw people is really problematic. So I think attitudes need to be looked at. And also attitudes in terms of cognitive processing and how we think about and frame experiences matter. So that's how, so we used a small portion of that scale to look at identity in this study. Identity's not been, I think we have a lot of work to do in Indian country on identity research. There's been some research that, again, looks at the cultural behaviors and then says, you know, it doesn't matter. And again, I would say, well, you know, that's problematic. You got to dig deeper. I think spirituality, traditionality, your level of connectedness. I actually think the number one issue, this is just my own anecdotal thought, over the years of doing this and participating in our communities through ceremony and stuff, is a sense of belonging. That I think one of the major impact of historical trauma is a disruption in your sense of belonging, whether it's to family, space, community, or place, or history. And I think one of the most healing things for identity, for especially our young people, is to reclaim their sense of belonging, and especially for our Two-Spirit people. So I'd like to see some more work done on that, around that. Hannibal.
You know, I think that's really interesting, and I think I don't know if this is part of what you're doing the study, but really examining that lateral
Oppression, the lateral oppression.
How much, is, compared to, oppression from outside sources is, not just the native piece, but also the LGBT Two-Spirit piece.
Right.
And also within our cities, like you were saying, I'm not gay and
Yeah.
people want to see that. So
Yeah.
kind of examining those differences.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah, did everyone hear Hannibal's question or comment? Was really looking at the role of lateral oppression, both not only in terms of being Native, but also in terms of Two-Spirit, LGBT identities, and the impact on everything from sense of belonging, identity. It's so hard doing this work because I had to first show that there's even a relationship between colonization and different kinds of events and these outcomes. But I think the deeper work in our own communities is to look at how we've internalized this and play it out with each other. And that's a little bit of our dirty laundry. But I do think it's meaningful work. We have it mostly in the qualitative narratives that we did. Not so much in, we have some data here. And interesting, we have microaggressions based on being Two-Spirit and microaggressions on being American Indian. And actually, the microaggressions being Two-Spirit were not as predictive of health and mental health outcomes as being Native. But that's our first runs, and it takes years to pull all this. We have so much data. But yeah, it's a good suggestion. Yeah.
What exactly does Two-Spirited mean?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, I'm going to look to some of my colleagues for help on this one. Two-Spirit is a placeholder in our communities. In this study, a lot of the people said, I like it being ambiguous, purposefully ambiguous, so that you can kind of plug in what it means to you as an Indigenous person. I think as a placeholder, the best way to think about it is it's a way Indigenous people identify from their own traditional understandings of what it means to be representative of their sexual and gender diversity that's not rooted in European binary categories, Eurocentric categories of sexuality and gender expression. And it follows on a history for a number of our tribes with, for example, in some tribes there's up to 7 genders. So there's a gender expression that is not like what you see in dominant discourse. The other piece is it recognizes, a lot of tribes have their own names and terms for people who play this 3rd status or this 4th status in their communities. And I think a common theme would be to say that sexuality and sexual orientation isn't the main way by which people identify themselves. It's just one of many ways that people identify themselves. So it's a way that in the 1990s that a group of LGBT activists up in Canada came together and said we need to come up with a term that captures the essence of male and female, that we're embodied, that who we are, that we can share, so that across tribes we have a way of talking to one another and understanding that we have a unique role either in our communities or who we are, and that we have a history that goes with that. It's kind of a long-winded question. Do you guys want to add to that?
Just I think it's from a historical perspective that before colonization, it was an honor, and it was revered, respected, and then with religious indoctrination in tribal communities, there was a chasm there.
Yeah.
So it became a negative thing.
Right.
So sort of reclaiming that was traditional respect and honor.
Yeah. I mean, a common thing across a lot of the tribes, and the studies that have been done on hundreds of tribes in this area, Two-Spirit people tended to play the role of mediator, either mediating between the spirit world and this world in terms of helping transition people for funerary practices or life, or other kind of transitions, mediating between men and women in terms of marriage and family and name giving and things like that. So quite often that mediation role was really important. Some of them were healers, and there's some really famous healers among a number of folks. But either way, quite often people were identified as young children through their own spiritual and ceremonial processes for assuming these roles in their community. And there was a life that followed with that and responsibility to the people. Some Two-Spirit people were the ones who camped on the outside of the encampment as a way to buffer between the outside world and this world. Some Two-Spirit people were brought to treaty meetings in DC because being able to have both perspectives, you can tell when people are lying. Anooksuk, Richard LaFortune gives an example of how he used to be taken around to the casinos because the grandmas would take him, and for the longest time he had no idea why he was going, and finally they said, "Do you bring us good luck because you're Two-Spirit?" So sometimes you get picked and you don't know why. Myself, and some people don't use the term Two-Spirit, so I also want to acknowledge that. A lot of our tribal people will say that's not the proper word for me, I don't feel comfortable with it. If you translate it in our indigenous language, it means like possession, it's not a good thing. So you need to find out from those native people you work with if that's the term that they want to use. I didn't use that term for myself for a really long time because I felt like it meant that there's a certain role that you play in the community and that's recognized. And so for years I called myself lesbian. And then it wasn't until the elders started calling me that I finally felt comfortable saying, okay, they've given me that's now, you know. And it happened in weird ways. Like for years I was helping with, I'd help with the fires for a sweat lodge just because I was asked by this elder to do it, and I just figured the elder just needed help, I don't know. I never knew that. It wasn't until years later his wife pulled me aside and she said, "You know why you were picked to do this?" And I go, "No, I just figured he needed help." And she said, "You're doing a man's job." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I guess that's true. In your way that would be true, right?" And she said, "No, it's because he picked you because you're Two-Spirit." Or one time I put the tobacco down the wrong direction and I was really all upset because I bought, protocol violation. And the elder just laughed and he said, "Well, you're Two-Spirit, you guys are allowed to do things backwards sometimes." So, and I had no idea. I mean, it's like it wasn't anything that I didn't assert that as being, the reason I needed to be there or doing that. So sometimes you get picked to do things that you don't even know, that people still carry that memory of you having certain in-between roles that you're still expected to play. Some of people say that that's why they're healers or they're counselors or social workers or other kinds of things, is that they're still fulfilling their ancient roles. So that's some of the discourse that happens in our communities.
We'll take one more question if someone has a burning question.
Yeah.
I have a research methodology question.
Sure.
Do you choose to use community-based research or indigenous research methodology when you're writing up your work? And if you do, how is that received and what the language is
Well, I tell you, I have no choice but to do community-based participatory research because our community wouldn't have it any other way, and I wouldn't either. And in terms of writing up, it's not. It depends on the situation. You mean in terms of outside people understanding, like grant funders kind of thing?
Or peer review journals?
Yeah, it's a little complicated because there's one grant we're doing right now where we have a listing of all the tribal people. They all wanted their names listed with a particular tribal community. And so we had to say, and the Healthy Hearts team. And we had to list all these people, and they're trying to figure out what to do. But, we worked it out. So, I mean, it can be done. The complication is, the key is having good communication with your community partners. Sometimes they want to be part of it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes, for different reasons, they don't have time. So how do you make sure you include them in that process? I think the biggest issue is the disconnect between the amount of time it takes to do data analysis and getting the information back to community. I think that's the biggest hurdle for these bigger projects. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.